An elite group of soldiers was given a deadly mission. Take a remote hill in the highland jungles of Vietnam.
I could tell we were heading into an ambush.
Come on! They faced a relentless enemy.
All hell broke out. Nothing was stopping them. They kept coming.
And an additional threat, fire from their own troops.
All I could think of was if they drop another bomb in here, there'll be nobody left.
I just wanted it to end.
Which would prove the deadlier threat, friend or foe, in the battle for Hill 875. The following program is a dramatic reconstruction based on the recollections of American military personnel who participated in these events. November the 19th, 1967. 3 companies of the 173rd Airborne Brigade were trapped on a remote hill in the highland jungles of Vietnam.
Papa 1, Papa 1, Bravo 6!
They were outnumbered, surrounded, and under heavy enemy fire. The soldiers were beginning to feel like they were in a death trap.
Lazada yelled at me that, Kelly, here they come.
Private Carlos Lazada was manning an M60 machine gun. He was the last line of defense against an enemy that was closing in fast.
They were probably within 20 yards of us. There was definitely a lot of them out there.
And we opened up on them, and they opened up on us with grenades and RPGs and weapons. I was feeding the belt into the gun, and we were just screaming at each other and shooting these guys. They just kept coming.
It was 1967. The US Army had been slugging it out with the North Vietnamese to control the Central Highlands for months. The war had been escalating for nearly a decade. More than 500,000 American troops were now in Vietnam. But the US military had yet to stop North Vietnamese advances, partly because of this dense forest. It protected the Ho Chi Minh Trail, North Vietnam's jungle road for moving men and munitions into the south. In the previous few days, large numbers of North Vietnamese troops had been spotted on a strategic hilltop near the trail. Hill 875, so named because it was 875 meters tall. If the MVA could be cornered here, perhaps the flow of enemy troops and arms could be slowed or even stopped. The American battle plan called for 3 companies of the 2nd Battalion 173rd Airborne to march up the north slope of Hill 875. Company C to the right, Company D to the left, and Company A protecting the rear. As they encountered the enemy, artillery and airstrikes would be called in to wipe the MVA out. It was a routine mission if it went according to plan. But the North Vietnamese had plans of their own for the American troops entering this dense jungle.
It was hot, humid. We had to deal with the fire ants. We had to deal with the leeches. We had to deal with spiders.
You were always in anticipation of being hit when you were traveling. And you always knew it could be you. Somebody's gonna die. This was always in the back of your mind. There was just so much vegetation, there was no way you could see the enemy. But because you were in their backyard, they were definitely watching you.
The jungle environment made combat especially dangerous. Visibility was often no more than 10 or 20 meters. Ambush was a constant worry.
One of the things that the North Vietnamese were very, very skilled in was cover and concealment. They were so clever in digging in and camouflaging and cutting fields of fire that you would usually be well up on them before you realized it.
The 2nd Battalion of the 173rd were definitely battle-scarred. They'd already lost nearly 150 men in recent jungle battles with the NVA. Now, as they approached Hill 875, some of the soldiers were wondering if they'd get out of these mountains alive. The only thing they could count on was the obligation they felt to look out for each other. As they closed in for the assault on Hill 875, Specialist 4th Class Razor Cone, Sergeant Steve Welch, and the rest of the company were marching through the jungle when they discovered an abandoned NVA base camp. It was about a mile from the hill.
As we walked into that base camp, it was like walking into a football stadium. It looked like it could bivouac over 1,000 men.
There was smoke coming out of some of the fires that had been built there, so you knew that they were fresh.
There was wire laid in for communications, which is rare. There was a number of what looked to be an aid station where NVA wounded had been treated.
It was a chilling sight and a warning. The NVA was clearly well prepared for a fight. The men of 2nd Battalion had discovered a North Vietnamese base, one they hadn't expected to find.
Everybody had a bad feeling the morning of the 19th because we knew going up that hill there was a good probability that the NVA would be up there and they would occupy the high ground.
There's a big mountain in the middle of nowhere in the jungle. And those of us that had been in a lot of firefights, we didn't like the looks of this at all. We'd hoped that we'd had a lot more men. Before we headed up there that morning, Father Waters had a communion service, and it was very appropriate because we were all feeling kind of uneasy.
Major Charles Waters was one of the 173rd's Catholic chaplains. Waters was 40 years old and wasn't required to be near the front line of combat, but that was where he wanted to be.
He was a wonderful man, and he would come out with the soldiers, and he was the only chaplain I ever saw out there slogging through the mud and the heat and the sweat and doing that kind of work.
Father Waters had a mass, and I decided I should go to it. Even though I'm not Catholic, I figured I needed all the help I could get because things just weren't looking that good on that hill.
After Mass, Father Waters comforted the soldiers before battle. In the background, they heard heavy artillery and airstrikes bomb the hilltop to soften up the enemy. Now it was time to head up Hill 875. The companies moved up the narrow ridge of the hill. Lieutenant Bart O'Leary was the commanding officer of Delta Company.
Unfortunately, the ridge line, the way we were proceeding, was very narrow. Didn't allow for a normal deployment of our units. There were actually 2 companies abreast. Delta Company was on the left of the ridge line. Charlie Company was on the right of the ridge line. And Alpha Company was in the rear. Plan was, if we made contact, of course, we were very close to Charlie Company. We'd link with them in the front, and then Alpha Company would form the back of the perimeter.
This was the traditional formation for a frontal assault used by the Army for decades. Unfortunately, it was a formation that was often catastrophic when used against well-entrenched North Vietnamese troops in the highlands. An advanced reconnaissance squad warned of dangers ahead.
Prior to our setting out up the hill, recon had gone towards the top with their dog. And what the dog is, it's like an early warning system. When they smell the NVA or when they know the NVA is present, you know, they'll go to an alert. And as they passed us, they said, be careful, you know, that the dog was alerted up there at the top of the hill and that there was probably a sizable force up there.
As I went by Sergeant Wooten of the recon squad, he looked at me and he said, watch your ass, Zach, because they're going to be after you.
Sergeant Steve Welch's squad was the first to advance.
At the edge of the tree line, when I looked out, I could tell that it looked like bunkers to me. It looked to me like we were going to walk into a kill area.
You could feel their eyes on you. You know, you knew they were there, and we just couldn't see anything.
Welch immediately radioed his commanding officer, Captain Harold Kaufman.
I called back to Captain Kaufman, and I asked if I could recon by fire. Recon by fire is when you bring everybody online, and then you open up. And if you get fire back, then you know that the enemy's there.
But Captain Kaufman was against the tactic. He believed it would give away his troops' position.
Captain Kaufman says, no, move your men out. Steve says, no, sir. He said, you know, doesn't look right. He said, move your men out.
After the second time of asking him whether or not we could recon by fire, he said, you know, to move your men out, and I wasn't going to ask him the third time, so I really had no choice at that point. But the people around me, I could tell were scared. After 11 months of pulling point, I could tell we were heading into an ambush, and there was no way to stop it from happening.
So Welch gave the order to march forward without any advance firing. Private Quinn was the first man to move into the clearing. He didn't get far.
We'd been in combat before, but we'd never seen anything like this. I dropped down to one knee, and I'm trying to see something. And next thing I saw, to my left, the brush was just being mowed down.
The men of Charlie and Delta companies were firing blind, unable to pick out the enemy. The problem was that the NVA were well concealed in fortified bunkers that had been skillfully camouflaged.
Being a machine gunner, once the firing started, I couldn't make a move without being shot at.
It was very difficult going. Everybody that moved seemed to get hit. I still couldn't see anything as far as the enemy or where the fire was coming from, and progress sort of stalled at that time.
Pulling together the men who hadn't yet been hit, Charlie and Delta companies struggled forward, but they were in serious trouble.
Touch of one medic, he came up alongside of me and he's, Doc, get the hell out of here. I said, they got this place pegged. And it was just a matter of me turning to my left and turning to my right, and he's dead. And everybody around me is dead or wounded.
The men of 2nd Battalion tried to advance 3 separate times. But each time, the deadly fire from the bunkers was simply too much. Just when it seemed that it couldn't get any worse, Specialist Razor Cone heard a sound that sent chills up his spine. A blare of bugles. It was something the North Vietnamese used to rally their troops. Worst of all, it was coming from behind the Americans.
It was something I had never heard before. And I'd been in country 8 months. And that was just another thing that reinforced the thought that we're into it big time.
This wasn't what battalion commanders had expected. 2 companies were totally pinned down by fire. It was clear the enemy was moving to surround the Americans. From 8 kilometers away, Alpha Company's Lieutenant Matt Harrison heard radio reports from the field. He knew his men were in grave danger.
Say again, requesting artillery support.
It was understood that things were going very badly. For the NVA, it was going to be a battle of annihilation. And it became exactly that. It was 2 groups of soldiers, no quarter asked, none given, and only one was going to walk away from there. It was going to be fought until one side was annihilated.
The enemy started with machine gun fire, but now they were lobbing mortars, rockets, and rocket-propelled grenades. Private Manuel Arona of Alpha Company was assigned to help the wounded men who were coming down the hill. it was a difficult task, with gunfire raining down on them.
Not only the point, but all over the perimeter, we started getting wounded from snipers, from B-40 rockets, from RPGs. The wounded were just coming from everywhere.
By early afternoon, Captain Michael Kiley, commander of Alpha Company, realized something had to be done to get the growing number of casualties off the hill. It was impossible to land helicopters in the dense jungle. Kiley called for axes, machetes and chainsaws to be dropped in. He took a platoon and began to hack out a crude landing zone at the base of the hill. As work got underway, Kiley feared that the NVA were now infiltrating below his position and could attack the men working to clear the landing zone. Kiley called for a squad to come down and protect the rear.
Myself, my machine gunner, Carlos Lozada, John Steer, who assisted the machine gunner, and another guy, went back down the trail to set up the observation post.
The four men moved some 50 meters below Kiley and his troops, where they hoped to provide an early warning if the enemy attacked. But as the soldiers reached their position, one of the men panicked.
Not good, man.
He screamed that the mission was suicidal and ran back up the hill.
When this other guy left, it was just maybe seconds after that when Lozada yelled at me that, Kelly, here they come. I don't have a clue how long they had been creeping up. I know that they had a lot of them.
We opened up on them, and they opened up on us with grenades and RPGs and weapons. And Carlos and I were screaming at each other, though we were only inches from each other, because I was feeding the belt into the gun. And we were just screaming at each other and shooting these guys, and they just kept coming.
The first thing I did is I flipped out a couple hand grenades at them, just to kind of get their attention, or to stop them as much as I could. And then, of course, I started firing my M16.
The three Americans, John Steer, James Kelly and Carlos Lozada, were now the last line of defense, protecting Alpha Company and perhaps the entire battalion from being overwhelmed.
Kelly is off on my right flank shooting at the enemy. And so I drop back, I cross the trail while Carlos is making sweeping bursts.
Ignoring the bullets whizzing around him, Lozada fired at the approaching NVA while slowly backing up the trail.
And then all of a sudden I heard the machine gun stop firing. And I thought, well, they're just reloading. No, this is not a problem. And then it didn't start again.
Then suddenly, a shot from an AK-47 slammed through John Steer's neck and shoulder.
I grabbed Carlos and I hollered, I'm hit. But when I grabbed Carlos, he was slammed into me. And I don't know if, I think it was like the same burst that got him and hit him in the head. Well, he come flying across the top of me, and I guess I about went nuts.
Well, Steer was screaming, and so I left my position to go over and see what had happened. And once I got over to where they were, I realized that Lozada was dead. I remember grabbing a couple hand grenades, throwing a couple more out, and grabbing Steer, and basically pushing him back up towards A Company, screaming, hollering at him to move, move, move.
And he starts dropping grenades behind us, and that's what, I guess, well, that's what saved our life.
Steer and Kelly ran for their lives. Now the advancing NVA threatened to swarm over Mike Kiley's men, who had been hacking out the landing zone. Kiley frantically radioed for help.
Kiley calls me and says, bring as many men as you can bring down here to help us. We're about to be overrun. So I took approximately half of the men I could get my hands on in my platoon and headed down toward the LZ that they were working on.
Tom Remington and his men rushed down the hill and tried to come to Kiley's rescue. but they ran head-on into the MVA, who were now pouring up the hill.
Looked like you were shooting right through them. Nothing was stopping them. They kept coming. They kept coming.
I know I had a bad shrapnel wound in my leg, and then a few seconds later, I was shot in the shoulder. But I mean, all of a sudden, 8, 9, 10 men with me. I think maybe 5 are dead, and all the other 5 are wounded. So, I mean, we never got to Captain Kiley.
Completely outnumbered, Kiley and 5 of his company struggled to hold off the inevitable. But they were overrun and shot at point-blank range. Nearby, the wounded men waiting to be evacuated were also killed. Several hundred meters away, Lieutenant Remington was scrambling to save what was left of his command. He screamed for his men to pull back and join with Delta and Charlie companies farther up the hill. If Alpha Company could regroup with the others, perhaps they could organize a defensive perimeter and survive.
Every soldier up there was scared to death that we were going to be overrun because there were casualties galore, below us, above us, and amongst us, everywhere. It's a strange thing. I had a serious leg wound, a serious shoulder wound, and yet I didn't really feel a lot of pain.
Remington ordered his men to dig foxholes. But because they had abandoned their rucksacks when they came under fire, they didn't have the right tools to dig with. They were forced to use anything handy.
The men, for once, they didn't hesitate to dig. They would get out their bayonets, their steel helmets, anything they could find and dig, because they knew the NVA were all around us, and they knew they didn't want to be above ground if the NVA were coming at us.
I think it was obvious to all of the soldiers there very quickly that they were fighting for their lives. Mike Kiley knew, Carlos Lozada knew, Tom Remington knew that if they were not successful in holding what they had, that the entire unit was going to be overrun and destroyed.
Amongst the rest of the troops, the outlook was even more bleak. In fact, few Americans on Hill 875 believed they'd get off this mountain alive. The men on Hill 875 were running low on ammunition, food and water. They also had many wounded in desperate need of air evacuation. But the North Vietnamese had surrounded them, and a deadly curtain of fire was making it impossible for rescue helicopters to land. 6 choppers were badly damaged or shot down trying to get to the threatened soldiers. Lieutenant Matt Harrison was about 8 kilometers from the action on the hill. He'd been listening to the desperate radio transmissions as his Alpha Company was devastated. His friend and commanding officer, Mike Kiley, had been killed.
Once I could no longer hear Mike Kiley on the command net, I knew that he was not functional because I knew Mike Kiley, and he was a great soldier.
By late afternoon of November the 19th, the 3 companies of the 2nd Battalion were surrounded on the hill. The men dug what cover they could and awaited the final attack.
Everybody had individual foxholes. So we'd dig, and then when a sniper sniped, we'd stop and shoot. But everybody at that particular time was very concerned about getting as far underground as possible.
2nd Battalion managed to organize a line of defense, but they had little hope that it would protect them against a direct attack by the North Vietnamese. In the meantime, they could only call in artillery and airstrikes to keep the MVA off balance. Unfortunately, the artillery strikes had little effect on the North Vietnamese bunkers. Heavy logs and a thick covering of earth on top of the bunkers made them impervious to anything but a direct hit. As the bombardment ended, the MVA retaliated with mortar and rocket fire, hand grenades and machine guns.
I was between 2 riflemen, and I had looked to one side, and I saw the right eye explode in the guy's head as the bullet went through it. And then when I looked to my right, the other guy caught one in the forehead, and he flopped down, and he died.
Through the attack, Father Charles Waters calmly moved among the men as if he was making house calls on a Sunday afternoon. He seemed oblivious to his own welfare. One moment he was carrying a wounded man to safety under heavy fire. The next he was giving last rites to a dying trooper.
During the afternoon, as water became shorter and shorter, Father Waters came up to me and he had his mass kit there, and he took out the two little plastic bottles. One was filled with holy water and the other one was filled with wine. And he said, "Bart, can you use this?" And I said, "Chaplain, please give it to the medics. The medics will be able to use it. Even the wine," I said, "that'll be welcome to some of the guys."
For Razor Cone, the chaplain's presence in the midst of such carnage was comforting.
He didn't have to be there, but he wanted to be with his boys. There was a time where I happened to be looking right at Father Waters, and he had a wounded guy in his lap, and he was giving him his last rites. And it just so happens that the sun happened to be shining right down through the trees, and he smiled at me. It was like this reassuring smile. His way of giving me some encouragement. It was just by the look on his face. And he was quite a man, he really was.
As darkness fell, the devastating fire from the MVA began to let up. For some reason, the North Vietnamese did not pursue their tactical advantage. For the men of 2nd Battalion, who expected to be swarmed at any moment, it was a mystery.
I'll never, ever know why they didn't keep coming. We had a lot of wounded, a lot of dead. I don't know why they didn't attack us.
For the moment, the Americans could only stay low and defend themselves as best they could. On the radio, they learned that one more US airstrike was coming in. In the gathering darkness, a Marine fighter bomber dove toward Hill 875. The exhausted troops hoped it would be a successful strike and give them some breathing space. The air controller told the pilot to drop his bombs where he could see napalm burning at the top of the hill. But perhaps confused by a friendly illumination flare, the pilot approached on the wrong course.
I just got back in that hole when I heard the jet come in. All day long, jets were making their bombing runs from east to west, across the ridge. And this one was coming in with the ridge, like north to south.
We were sitting there talking, and all of a sudden, the aircraft made his run right up the ridgeline. And I looked up and I said, "What is he doing?"
The pilot was making his run from directly behind the men of 2nd Battalion, on a course aimed right at them.
I remember looking behind me and seeing the bomb leave the jet. I could see the jet, I could see the bomb leaving the jet, and the bomb looked like it was coming right at me, and I thought to myself,
Manuel Arona was digging a foxhole with another soldier when the jet roared overhead.
I remember I went down for a scoop of dirt, and then that's when the bomb hit.
There was a guy in the hole with me. I threw him in, and I piled on top of him, made sure I got my head below ground, and the bomb exploded.
That bomb landed directly in the center of the 2nd Battalion's perimeter. Captain Harold Kaufman was obliterated. Father Charles Waters and all the wounded he was tending vanished in an instant.
The man that I was in the position with, half of his body was gone. And then while I was looking up, I could see the body parts on the trees, on the limbs. And I shook myself out of it. I got up, and it was so quiet.
It was really eerie quiet for about 10, 15 seconds. And then all of a sudden, the guys behind me who were above ground started screaming and yelling, calling for their mother. You know, my legs are gone. Mom, Mom. And It was bad. It was bad.
John Steer, although gravely wounded, was still alive.
Blood was coming out of my mouth and my nose and my ears, and I noticed my right arm was gone because I went to pick it up and it was just hanging by some tissue and some sinews on the inside here. I remember I cried out then, "God, don't let me go to hell." And I knew I was dying.
Bart O'Leary had been knocked unconscious. When he came to, no one around him was recognizable.
Down the hill from me to my left was the area where the medics had all the wounded. And there were approximately 35 guys there. You couldn't identify any person or bodies that were there.
The bomb carved a crater big enough to hold a dump truck. Flame and steel ripped across the perimeter, killing 42 men and wounding 45. It was one of the worst friendly fire incidents of the Vietnam War. Tom Remington feared that other bombs might be on the way.
All I could think of was if they drop another bomb in here, there'll be nobody left. So I began to search for a radio. I finally found a radio. So I called back to Fire Support Base 16. I talked to a lieutenant there, and I told him, stop those airplanes. Don't let them drop another bomb. They're killing us up here.
As darkness closed in to obscure the horrific casualties, the survivors spread out to reform the defensive perimeter. Military organization was all but gone. The men simply did the best they could. Everyone still expected an NVA night attack.
It was a long night. It seemed like every minute was an hour or longer.
That night was absolutely hell on earth. I mean, it was just desolate up there, scary. The smell, the soldiers said it was just death in the air.
Their situation had been precarious enough before the bomb. Now Charlie and Delta companies were severely battered, and Alpha Company was virtually wiped out. There were few officers left. Lieutenant Tom Remington tried to keep his men's spirits up.
I had more shrapnel in the left leg and left arm from the bomb, and my eardrums were gone. I mean, I just pretty much tried to encourage the men to hang in there and keep their positions manned. I said, help will be here tomorrow. I didn't know the help would be here tomorrow, but I told them that.
Remington had no idea if help would come. All he could do was push the beleaguered airborne fighters to stay alive just one more night.
Guys in the foxhole were there in the quiet, in the dark, and many of them had wounded or dead soldiers next to them. Not a good night to be alone.
About 7 kilometers away, Company B of 4th Battalion was ready to move out, but they had to wait until first light. Meanwhile, the men on Hill 875 had no idea that help was on the way. All they could do was comfort the dying. Tom Remington found one of his men with both feet blown off.
He was alive, and all I could do was try to comfort him. I had no way to medicate him or do anything. So I held his head in my lap, and he bled to death. And it was horrible. But, you know, I had to move on, and I had to make the men that were still alive get back in position and maintain a perimeter.
Rebuilding the perimeter came just in time. The MVA were quick to take advantage of the darkness. Manuel Arona was trying to help the wounded when he heard a strange sound.
I remember hearing whistles at this time, a couple of real sharp whistles, and I had heard them before, but I never paid attention to them. And then somebody else, they're coming.
RPGs illuminated the night. AK-47s flashed in the jungle foliage. Suddenly, MVA troops made their move.
When the flares, you could hear them pop, and the NVA would get down until the illumination was out, and then they'll come back up again.
The NVA were screaming, the people behind us were screaming. And It just got to the point where I'd seen so much in 11 months that I just wanted it all to end. And I just thought to myself, I just hope my parents know that I went down fighting.
But the North Vietnamese attack was not coordinated. They concentrated on just one part of the line.
I remember saying to myself that I wonder how long this is going to keep up, because we won't last too much longer. And all of a sudden, it just stopped.
The MVA did not attack again. The jungle remained silent, except for the moans of the wounded. The dawn of a new day revealed what had happened on Hill 875 the night before. 2nd Battalion of the 173rd Airborne had effectively been destroyed as a fighting force.
Early on the 20th, the morning after the bomb dropped, at first light, you could finally see the bomb crater and the full extent of the damage that bomb did, and the number of bodies and wounded, and it was just unbelievable.
American artillery and airstrikes resumed, but they could do nothing to help the men of 2nd Battalion. By all rights, this unit should have been pulled back. Those who were still alive were in no shape to fight off another major attack or even fight their way back to safety.
We weren't going anywhere. So the only relief we could get would be for somebody to come out and reinforce us.
Their only hope of surviving was the 4th Battalion, which was doing its best to get there. A barrage of artillery shells was fired ahead of the moving infantry. The tactic finally broke the MVA line at the base of the slope. Hill 875 was no longer surrounded. Throughout the morning, the MVA continued to pour rocket and mortar fire on the wounded and suffering Americans. But by afternoon, the North Vietnamese stopped firing, and 4th Battalion finally arrived. The battered, exhausted men hoped their ordeal was over.
Word was passed not to shoot at them coming up the ridge, that they were near. There was no cheering when the 4th Battalion came in, but there was certainly an upward lifting of spirits.
It was unbelievable to see new faces, to see fresh faces, to see the water. The first thing anybody wanted was the water.
They brought water, they brought ammunition, and they brought bodies that were able to fill in the positions and give us a great amount of relief.
Not long after 4th Battalion arrived, Alpha Company Executive Officer Matt Harrison, who'd been back at field headquarters, was finally able to get in by helicopter and rejoin his men. He knew the situation was bad, but he wasn't prepared for what he found.
It was like stepping into the third circle of hell.
Only after the American 4th Battalion arrived at Hill 875 could the true extent of the devastation be measured. As Executive Officer Matt Harrison moved through the wreckage that had once been his command, he could identify only 25 of the more than 125 men who started out with Alpha Company. He came upon Tom Remington.
I recall encountering Tom fairly soon after I got there. My recollection is he had dried, crusted blood on the sides of his face where he had bled from the ears. Obviously filthy, exhausted.
He spoke to me, and I asked him for water. Did he have any? And he said, sure, and called me Tommy, and he gave me water.
The men from 4th Battalion took over defensive positions on the perimeter. The battered soldiers they replaced hobbled or were carried to the rear, down the trail Carlos Lozada had given his life to defend. Lozada would receive the Congressional Medal of Honor for his heroism. Father Charles Waters would also receive the Medal of Honor. In total, more than 150 men of the 173rd Airborne gave their lives to hold on to what they had captured. over 400 were wounded. Helicopters were finally able to set down on the landing zone that had been paid for with the lives of Captain Kiley and his men. Yet the fight for Hill 875 was far from over. For 3 more days, the men of 4th Battalion and a few members of the 2nd would fight more bloody battles to push back the MVA. Finally, on November the 23rd, 1967, the top of Hill 875 was taken. After so much bloodshed, the North Vietnamese had quietly abandoned their bunkers and escaped into neighboring Cambodia. Other than a few shouts of victory, there was little celebration to mark the taking of a prize that had required such sacrifice. On November the 25th, Army helicopters lifted the last American soldiers off of Hill 875. The little mountain that had cost so many lives was held by paratroopers for only 2 days. Now it was just another hill, although one whose top was scorched and treeless from so much bombing. There was some bitterness among soldiers who had seen so many comrades die, only to have the prize relinquished so quickly.
Well, I remember when we landed in the fire support base. I remember it was either a 2 or 3 star general was standing there. He asked Harmon, you know, what was it like up there? And I remember Harmon saying, it wasn't worth it, sir. And I think we all kind of felt the same way. It was just another hill. And, you know, tomorrow we'd be fighting another hill and giving up that territory as well.
Nevertheless, most survivors took heart in the fact that they had done all that had been asked of them, and more.
I didn't care about Hill 875. None of us cared about Hill 875. I think maybe it was a little bit startling that we essentially made it to the top and then half an hour later we're gone. But I think most of us we knew we hadn't been fighting for a piece of terrain.
According to several published accounts, the American Army had never intended to hold onto a remote hill in the Central Highlands. What it had hoped to accomplish was to disrupt traffic on the Ho Chi Minh Trail. But that objective could not be achieved. The trail was actually several trails that ended in no single point. Some trails were designed for vehicles, from lorries to bicycles. Others were simply muddy paths in the jungle, intended only for foot traffic. At its longest, the route traveled more than 16,000 kilometers. The strength of the trail was that almost all of it was hidden by overhanging jungle. This meant that even the relentless American bombing had little effect. Still, none of this diminishes the sacrifice made by so many men of the 173rd Airborne.
A day doesn't go by without me thinking about them, one way or another. I owe my life to those people, the caliber of men that I was with. I would not be here today if it weren't for them. I feel I owe it to them to tell their story.